Housekeeping, if you're looking for a restroom, they are downstairs. If you go down the steps to the left, you'll find the men's room on the right and the ladies' room on the left. So that's where the restrooms are. We are hopefully live streaming. We're also Zooming. So there's going to be a lot of technical things going on. So we just ask you to refrain from questions till the end. And if you have a question that's rather extensive and you need to come up to where Chester's briefcase is and kind of stand there, so that our live stream mic will pick you up. That's what that little disc on that table is. So we want to make sure that the people out in virtual land can hear the questions when they're asked. So if you have a question at the end, I'll invite you to come up and ask that way. Before we begin the official program, we do have a special guest. Beth Landmasser wanted to come up and tell you about an exciting travel opportunity that is coming up. And so she asked me if she could just take a minute to come up and speak to you about that. So please welcome Beth Landmasser.
You always have to have a commercial. Some of you might know that Bob Wolensky and Bodie Marin from the Scranton Anthracite Heritage Museum and I put together a trip to the UK 3 years ago, and we kept postponing it. And we finally got to go last June, and it was very well received. We had a wonderful time. And so we decided, since we had such a good time, we were going to do another one. So in September of 2024, we are going to do another Britain's Industrial Heritage Tour. And we will start off in Glasgow for 3 nights. And we will be, this is a very tentative itinerary. A lot of things could possibly change. New Lanark, it's called. It's a World Heritage Site. It's an 18th century mill village. We've got some museums dedicated to shipbuilding. We're going to possibly go to the Isle of Bute, which was owned by the gentleman who built Cardiff Castle in Wales. Then we're going to Liverpool/Manchester for 3 nights. There's a People's History Museum, a walking tour, Science and Industry Museum, an Anderton boat lift. That sounds very interesting to me. Then we're going to North Wales, and while we're in North Wales, we will be visiting a slate museum that I've been to a number of times. It's very interesting, very informative. And we're also going to be looking at the bridges and aqueducts that were built by Thomas Telford, the Menai Suspension Bridge, the Conway Suspension Bridge, and an aqueduct. I'm not even going to try and pronounce that one. And then we'll be in Birmingham for 1 night. And then in South Wales, we'll be staying in and around Swansea, where there was a revolutionary new Welsh process for smelting copper. So that will be what we'll be looking at when we're in South Wales. And on our trips that we did last year, Bob and Bodie contacted a lot of their people that they know over there to come and give us talks in the evening or come with us on our bus tour. And it was wonderful. And it's not just going to be industrial history. We will be doing other things. Probably when we're in North Wales, if the weather permits, we'll go up to the top of Snowdon, which is the highest point in the UK outside of Scotland. It's also the mountain that Edmund Hillary practiced on before he went up Everest. So I have a sign-up sheet here I'm going to put over on that table over there. If you're interested, please put your name and your email address down there, and we'll put you on a mailing list to get more information when we get some more firm itinerary and a price. The price will include your airfare over. What we did last time was we all met up at the Anthracite Heritage Museum. We got a bus that took us to the airport and brought us home from the airport when we got back. And all of that was included in the price that will be quoted. Okay, thank you.
Travel adventures like that. So thank you, Beth, and especially when they include a little heritage and history. Happy to. So this is the second last program of Anthracite Mining Heritage Month. Today's program is called Brief Histories of 4 Anthracite Coal Companies, which include the Penn Anthracite, the Delaware and Hudson, the Butler Coal Company, and the Pennsylvania Coal Company. Before we begin, I do want to take a moment to offer a few words of appreciation. First, to our hosts here at the Albright Memorial Library. Scott Thomas is the director, and he and his team have been extremely helpful in helping us with all of the technical setup, and as well as providing a beautiful room. Specifically, Jess, Brian, and Ernie. They were here with us for 3 or 4 hours the other day, just trying to figure out where to put microphones and cameras and how to make it work best. So much thanks to them, as well as to LHS Creative Director Olivia Bernardi. She is the woman behind the curtain today, and she is making the magic happen, I hope. Thanks, Liv. So, and also my assistant director, Sarah Pacini, is on her way here. She was actually at the Historical Society, so she'll be joining us in a few moments. And there's 3 of us at the Historical Society, and really we only accomplish what we do because the 3 of us work so well together. So I also want to thank Bob Wolensky and the many partners who come together each January to celebrate all things anthracite. This year, the partners included the Anthracite Heritage Foundation, the Anthracite Heritage Museum, King's College, Luzerne County Historical Society, the Plymouth Historical Society, the Nanticoke Historical Society, the Greater Pittston Historical Society, the Greater Hazelton Historical Society and Museum, the National Museum of Industrial History. Mike is here from there today. WVIA Public Broadcasting, the Anthracite Chapter of the Society of Mining Engineers, Eastern Pennsylvania Coalition for Abandoned Mine Reclamation, the Susquehanna Brewing Company, Below Gift Funeral Home, and the Knox Mine Disaster Memorial Committee. So isn't it amazing that in 1 month, all of these groups can come together to celebrate our heritage? And I am very proud to be part of this event. It's wonderful when we can plan local events like this that are informative and educational and also have such a broad reach across the region. There were programs up and down northeastern Pennsylvania this month, and I hope you were all able to partake of some of them. And that is also why I'm here, happy to know that our friends from Pennsylvania Cable Network are here today recording this program to further spread the word. So thanks to them as well. Can everyone hear me? Yes, okay, then we will be good to go. So I also, one more housekeeping, if you are looking for some libations when we're done here, we do have a happy hour at Sidel's restaurant. That's 1202 North Main Ave. The library closes at 5, so I want to make sure I encourage all of our live audiences to go over and buy a beer and celebrate Anthracite Heritage in North Scranton with me. So I hope you can. Our first speaker is Charles Kumpas. Charles is a native of Lackawanna County, and he's had an interest in local anthracite mining history for a very long time, starting when he researched his own family history and learned about his father's time working in the Marvin Colliery in Scranton for several years after World War II. Charlie retired from MetLife Insurance Company's Clark Summit Computer Center after 33 years. And for many years, he's a member of the Anthracite Heritage Museum Board of Directors, where he was also the editor for the Miner's Lamp newsletter. And in that role, he wrote 22 articles on mining related topics. Currently, he serves as an active member of the Abington Area Historical Committee and helps the Lackawanna Historical Society with any mining related questions that might come up. His talk today will focus on the Penn Anthracite Collieries Company, which is a local coal company that we don't know too much about. So hopefully Charlie will fill us in. Charlie?
Well, thank you, Mary Ann, and I hope everybody can hear me too, because I'm a little bit low voice. I guess so. Okay, first, Mary Ann. Okay, I guess that's my first slide. Is it going to fill the screen?
Yep.
Okay. It is. Okay, my whole adventure with Penn Anthracite began when I was working on my family history, as she alluded to in the write-up. I went there because several people in my family in the city directory I saw worked at the Penn Anthracite Collieries Company. and I knew nothing about it. I said, well, I'm going to find out. So I went to the company. Next, please.
1 second.
Certainly. Here goes my 15 minutes.
That's to get next.
And I met this gentleman, Mr. William Graham. Friendly person, he invited me in, and that building behind was their office building on the Colliery property of the Von Stork Colliery. And inside, he took me right to a file of everybody who used to work in the company. And I found my two people. And I looked around and the whole building was filled with company information. I couldn't believe where I was because I'm interested in mining history and I did not know this company. So he invited me to come back and I did. So every few weeks, beginning after that time, I worked through all the records that he would show me. They had all the minutes of all the books of all the companies that you're going to see here. They were all there. They had everybody who had leases, everybody, they had all the maps of all the collieries that became part of Penn Anthracite Colliery. It was an amazing amount of information that they had. So next, please. So when did the company start? Black Friday occurred 1929. Depression started 1929, right after that. Next, please. And then when did the Penn Anthracite Company start? Right in the beginning of the Depression, which is interesting. Next, please. So quickly, look at the company. You have the sheets. Here's where I'd be first focusing on the Colliery Company, Penn Anthracite. But it was born from this company, the South Penn Colliery Company. And to make this work, they pulled in this company, become the Penn Anthracite Colliery in 1931. So you could see how it flowed. The Penn Anthracite is like the son of South Penn and this company. And when it became functioning, it did all these sub-companies. Next, please. This was an interesting, the one that was on the left that doesn't become part of the company until 1931 was the Elk Hill, an old company that was the first companies in Lackawanna County to actually mine coal. And this man was the main man, William H. Richmond. He was Richmond Hill. He had his mansion where Johnson School is now. That became Richmond Hill. And he had several companies until he died in 1922. And that property was later sold to Mr. Johnson and it became Johnson School. Next, please. So he was one of the first coal operators in the county. Next, please. That's what their certificate looked like. Next. A little advertisement of their company. Next. And this is one of their breakers that you see in the slide there, the West Ridge. Over there, St. Joseph's Church, if you want to figure out where it is. Next. This is the one up in the Kaiser Valley, the house. Next. We also had this one up in Dixon City, the Johnson. Next. We had this one up in Peckville, the Ontario. Next. We had this one up in the Archibald area. Next. And that's what the Elk Hill brought to the table in 1931. Next on the piece is, if you look at the South Penn, and if you look up, we have the Leggetts Creek. That became part of the South Penn, which filtered down to the Penn Anthracite. This is a company that D&H, if you remember, started the canal company way back in the 1800s, and they had the Gravity Railroad. But to feed the Gravity Railroad, they ran out of collieries they can get by gravity. So they started coming down into Lackawanna County with trains. And they started coming into Dixon City into North Scranton. And in North Scranton, this is along Parker Street, North Scranton, the Legacy Creek Anthracite Company. The D&H started that in 1868. Actually, they took a lease of it. They took the lease and mined it. Next, please. Next. And that was the breaker that was on that site, the Legacy Creek, built by the D&H. It became an old one and around the 1900s, 1910s. And this company would pay royalty to mine that property, and the royalties started getting lower. So the people who had the lease called it back. They booted the D&H out and they became their own company, which became the Legacy Creek Coal Company, which you saw. So that was 1919. They booted them out and became an independent company. Next. We had the Von Storage Company. That was also a D&H property when they were coming down. They opened up the Von Storage property, which is right at the bottom of the Greenridge Street Bridge to the left. It was a flat area at the time, and they built the breaker and the shaft. And they built that one. That was their own. They built the property themselves in 1873. So they ran that for a while, and then in 1925, a company bought them out. They bought the deeds. They said, well, we're going to mine it. So next, this was the Von Storch Colliery when they first built it in 1873. Next, they built this in the turn of the century to get more production because of all the coal they're pulling in. And next, we had this one that the South Penn took over. When they took over the Von Storch, they took over the Legacy Creek. They brought them together and they made the South Penn, which you see on your chart, started in 1925. So they had the coal from those two, and they needed a better processing plant. So they built this in 1925, which is one of the best ones of the fields at the time they built it. It had cones in it. Processing, if you know what that is, it's a better way of processing with sand mixture. They had a rotary dump. They would bring the cars in and they'd actually dump into filtering down. So it was a very advanced colliery when it was built in 1926, 27. So where are we now? We're into Penn Anthracite collieries on your company. And then Penn, the South Penn, with the name of South Penn, really started in the south. They started in the southern fields and they had the Randolph Colliery, which you see on the right. So the South Penn, next please, had three pieces. It had the southern fields, it had the Von Storch, and it had Legacy Creek. And here's what the property looked like. This is Lackawanna River, and they had the Von Storch breaker. This is the Greenridge Street Bridge right here. And they mined out this area and they went into here with a slope. So they mined this whole area of North Scranton. That's, if you know the area, it's a hilly area going up several tiers. Next, please. So South Penn, as you can see, quickly moving along, had the southern fields, and they added pieces of in the northern fields, and that became the South Penn Colliery. Next, please. And they started their office in the Bowman Building on Linden Street in Scranton. I walked by that many times going to the University of Scranton. It was right there. I walked by that hundreds of times, and I never knew what was in there. Next, please. But then they started having problems. All the companies of that area were having problems because, as we said, the depression was going on, coal prices were dropping. Actually, if you read the minutes, there's a lot of mild winters and several years going on. So they had excess coals. All the coal companies were really competing against each other. And then we're starting to get alternate fuels. At this time, starting to get people using oil, gas. So coal was starting to have lots of problems in making profits, such that they were running out of money to run. They had a first mortgage, and they tried to get money from other companies, other banks, and they couldn't get any loan. So they put out a second mortgage on their company to bring money in, to get the South Penn to keep on working. And they ran out of money again. So one of the companies that loaned money to the South Penn called the loan that we want our money. So they went to court. The court gave the company a receiver to run the company, and they set up a reorganization committee to try and figure out how to make this company still poor with everything going on. So they created a system where they figured if we used the South Penn on your chart, that area with their nice big breaker, and they pulled in all the coal company colliery properties from the Elk Hill. We have all this coal, make them together and make the company work. So that's what they did. Next, please. What I just said. Next, please. So, right, the organization committee gave several coal people who knew the industry, came together, and they took out a mortgage for their company, and they created the Penn Anthracite 1931. Next, please. And they put out preferred and common stocks. Next, please. So what did they do? Well, to make money, they started doing what they said. They started to operate all the properties because all the breakers of the Elk Hill were old and they were not usable anymore. So they started funneling all the coal into the Penn Anthracite. And so they started the Southern Field. They started a subsidiary which took that the Randolph, which you saw from South Penn, and they made it independent. Next, please. That's the Randolph Coal Company that the Southern Penn owned. Next, please. Then they created an ice and fuel company in the Lackawanna County. They set up three places, and they tried to sell coal in downtown Scranton on Mifflin Avenue, a place in Southside, and a place in Dunmore. And it went good for a while, but then got low sales in the 40s, worse in 1941. If you look at the minutes, they kept talking about ferocious competition. And that's what it was. These companies are all fighting together for a smaller piece of the pie because of people using less coal. And that company went away. Next, please. Then they tried this company. They bought it and they tried to process coal from a coal bank. And that didn't turn out financially well. So that went out of business. Next, please. Then he created a mine up there in North Scranton going up along Ferdinand Street. And that did well for a while, but it ran out of coal. And then they had the Shepton down in Southern Field. They tried to lease. They had a lease, but they tried to sublease it because they weren't getting good royalties from it. And then in time, that went away in 1940. Next, please. So what were we doing to try and sell coal? They went into with other companies and a grouping of industry sales. They created their own. They created called black storage anthracite, different from the D&H or the blue coal of Ronalden. Next, please. And they're going to different places. They could set up their sales places. This is just one layout. See you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. We'll see that later. And that's another one of their phrases, or Sashmore call. So they try to sell their product. There's no doubt about it. Next, please. Next. And these were handouts. In those days, everybody would write with the pens of ink that they had, and they used blotter. So these were a handout, different blotters that they would hand to people as a way of people remembering their company. So next, please. I'm talking about their way of processing coal. Next, please. Next. Another blotter. Okay. So what happened? Smaller mines. The biggest mine area that they were getting coal from was the Von Stork, and it ran out of coal. And they had that big coal breaker sitting outside the Von Stork breaker. They had all these other places giving coal from the Elk Hill areas, but they were not giving a volume of coal. So they were not getting enough volume in to really make that Von Stork breaker work. So they shut it down. Next, please. Next. So then what did they do? In 1954, well, coal ran out 1947, and they started leasing all the properties to different people who would then go and take that coal and have it processed somewhere else. And in 1947, they tried to sell the Von Stork breaker and no one would buy it. So in 1948, they sold the breaker and they dismantled it. So then they decided in a meeting in 1954, the directors, to just start selling land, make money, just sell all the land and bring in what you can and still get leases and people paying royalties as long as it would last. So from 1954 until the closure at 1996, that's what they were doing. Selling land, selling land, selling land. And you can, I know the properties, they became under house tracks. One became under the Circle Drive-In. Old Vance was their old company property. And eventually they sold everything down to their final office building. In 1996, they sold their final office building on December 30th. And at that time, all the stock was given to the state. That was left that people did not claim, went to a sheet, that went to the state. And they closed the company up and sold the last building. So that was a quick rundown on the Penn Anthracite and its pieces. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlie.
You're quite welcome.
Okay, as I said, we're going to hold questions until the end. Richard, you could come in, find a seat. So our next speaker is Chester Kulesa, who is one of my favorite people in the entire world. When I started my journey in the historical field, I did an internship at the Anthracite Heritage Museum with Chester Kulesa. So he is the reason I'm here today. So, well, personal, thank you, Chester. Chester is a retired historic site administrator and currently a volunteer at the Anthracite Heritage Museum and Scranton Iron Furnaces of the Pennsylvania Historic and Museum Commission. He also serves as the chairman and secretary of the Greenfield Township Historical Society and secretary of the Northeastern Pennsylvania Coast Guard Veterans Association. He will offer a brief general presentation touching on 4 parts of the Delaware and Hudson, or D&H, anthracite history, the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company, the Delaware and Hudson Gravity Railroad, the Delaware and Hudson Railway, and the Hudson Coal Company. Ladies and gentlemen, Chester Kulesa.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Mary Ann, for that presentation, and thank you for moderating this program and setting everything up today. We really appreciate it. When Bob and Mary Ann emailed me about making this presentation, I was very interested to do so. The charters from Pennsylvania and New York to the Wirtz brothers, originators of the Delaware and Hudson, were in 1823. So here we are in 2023 with the opportunity to reflect on 200 years of D&H history and its legacy. Have the next slide, please. As Mary Ann said, my presentation today will touch on 4 parts of the Delaware and Hudson, or D&H history. The Delaware and Hudson Canal Company, the Delaware and Hudson Gravity Railroad, the Delaware and Hudson Railway, and the Hudson Coal Company. Next slide, please. The objective of mining coal in the northern anthracite field and transporting it to New York City was promoted by Philadelphia businessmen William and Maurice Wilkes. On March 13th, 1823, the Pennsylvania legislature approved an act for the brothers to canalize the Lackawaxen River. On April 23rd, 1823, the New York legislature passed a special act to incorporate the D&H Canal Company to open water access between the Delaware and Hudson rivers and the right to purchase coal lands and transport coal. The Wilkes brothers were two pioneers who founded the coal industry in Carbondale and were originators of the D&H. They came to the area in search of coal lands. At Carbondale and Archbald, they bought several thousand acres and founded Carbondale by 1822. May I have the next slide, please? The D&H Canal followed the banks of four rivers, the Lackawaxen until it met the Delaware. The canal boats crossed the Delaware and followed the New York shore of the Delaware River to Port Jervis, New York. From Port Jervis, the canal turned eastward, following the Neversee Creek to Roundout Creek to the Hudson River. The canal was constructed between 1825 and 1828. May I have the next slide, please? At one point, the company employed more than 2,500 workers at a cost of $12 to $14 per month to dig and build a canal. These laborers, many of whom were Irish and German immigrants, worked by hand with pick, shovel, and blasting powder. The canal from Honesdale to Roundout near Kingston, New York, was 108 miles long. This map was done by the Wayne County Historical Society. There's a copy on exhibit at the Anthracite Heritage Museum. I think their edition is 1954, but it's a great map. It shows some of the images that were important to the D&H. And particularly like this, there's a profile of the canal that you can see here. Very nicely done. May I have the next slide, please? Between 1847 and 1851, John A. Roebling built 4 suspension aqueducts to carry the Delaware and Hudson Canal over the 4 creeks and rivers previously mentioned. Next slide, please. Only the Delaware Aqueduct, also known as Roebling's Bridge, stands today. Following abandonment of the canal in 1898, the structure was converted to a private highway bridge, which function it continues to serve, spanning the Delaware River above Port Jervis as America's oldest existing wire suspension bridge. It is a National Civil Engineering Landmark preserved by the National Park Service as part of the Upper Delaware Scenic and Recreational River. Now, this is an isometric of the aqueduct. It's done by the Historic Engineering, American Engineering Record. Here's the canal water. Here's a canal boat, the tow line to the mule and the driver. These are the abutments over the Delaware River. And as I mentioned, Roebling built 4 of these. And although this rests on the abutments, what's really holding the weight here, number 3 on the isometric, these cables that Roebling made. And just to give you an idea of these cables, this is 7-stranded steel cable, 8.5 inch in diameter. So it's very, very strong. And this is what Roebling used to support that weight, because it's incredible. He has these wooden trunk aqueducts with the water and all of that weight going over the rivers. So a real engineering marvel, in my opinion. May I have the next slide, please? Pulled by mules, canal boats moved at speeds of 1 to 3 miles per hour and were manned by families. Wives and children worked 15 to 20-hour days alongside boatmen. The round trip took 15 days. May I have the next slide, please? At Roundout near Kingston, New York, the canal boats were emptied. The coal was transported by contracted coal barges or steamships to New York City. For 70 years, the Delaware and Hudson Canal Company moved millions of tons of anthracite to market. In 1898, the last canal boat load of coal made the trip from Honesdale, Pennsylvania to round out New York. After the canal was closed, it was drained, the canal land sold and split up. On April 28, 1899, the corporation changed its name to the Delaware and Hudson Company, which reflected the loss of the canal. The company operated the Delaware and Hudson Railway. And on this map, you see from Carbondale, Honesdale is the Gravity Railroad, D&H Gravity Railroad. This dotted blue line is the canal going up to round out at Kingston, New York. And here we have the Hudson River, which takes us down to New York City. The D&H had also a very large coal storage yard and docks at Weehawken, New Jersey, that they could use as a port to send coal to New England as well. May I have the next slide, please? The Delaware and Hudson Gravity Railroad was a narrow gauge or 4-foot 3-inch wide railroad that carried anthracite from Carbondale over the Music Mountains to the Delaware and Hudson Canal in Honesdale, Wayne County, Pennsylvania. The Gravity Railroad used stationary engines to pull coal wagons, as they were called, or cars, up steep inclined plains. Between the plains, the cars traveled on graded levels, descending by gravity, drawn by horses or locomotives. May I have the next slide, please? The Delaware and Hudson Gravity Railroad was constructed between 1826 and 1829 under D&H engineer John B. Jervis. It was improved, modified, and expanded between the years 1829 and 1868 and produced new configurations in 1845, 1859, and 1868. With these modifications, the Gravity Railroad used separate loaded and light tracks. The anthracite loaded cars moved on tracks for 15.5 miles in the direction of Honesdale, and the light or return tracks of 21 miles had empty cars returning to Carbondale. And just to, if I may have the next slide. Yes, thank you. At Honesdale, the coal was transferred from Gravity Railroad cars to canal boats. May I have the next slide, please? As mentioned earlier, at Roundout near Kingston, New York, the canal boats were unloaded. Contracted Hudson River vessels transported the coal to New York City by way of steamships or towed barges. May I have the next slide, please? I wish to quote here from Etz Fletcher Wayburn, quote, "The Delaware and Hudson Company helped materially in making a market for anthracite. It was this company that started the use of hard coal in ships in New York Harbor. In 1835, it provided coal for a trial trip of the ferry boat Essex and fitted up the furnaces of a wood-burning ship with hard coal grates. The trial was a success and led to the general use of coal on steamships," end quote. May I have the next slide, please? On August 8, 1829, the D&H's first locomotive, the Stourbridge Lion, made history as the first imported commercial steam locomotive to run on rails in the United States of America. The locomotive was the latest transportation technology built in Great Britain. May I have the next slide, please? Jervis's assistant engineer, Horatio Allen, brought it to Honesdale. However, the Stourbridge Lion was soon retired as it was too heavy for the tracks it was to travel on. Parts of it were acquired by the Smithsonian Institution in 1889. D&H did not operate its next locomotive until the Major Sykes and C.P. Wirtz arrived in 1860. May I have the next slide, please? Extensions of the railroad opened access to new mines in Archbald in the 1840s, Valley Junction near Oliphant in 1858, Providence around 1860, and Center City, Scranton in 1863. In 1862, the Delaware and Hudson operated the Von Stork mine in Scranton, building a narrow gauge railroad to connect the gravity railroad at Archbald. May I have the next slide, please? During the Civil War, however, with the demand for anthracite at an all-time high, the company knew that to meet obligations, railroad operations had to be expanded. Following the Civil War, the last addition of any of its kind to its gravity railroad operation was carried out. The Delaware and Hudson purchased additional coal holdings from Carbondale to Wilkes-Barre. These included the Howard Coal and Iron Company, Union Coal Company, and the Plymouth and Wilkes-Barre Railroad and Bridge Company. At the time, the D&H did not have direct authority to operate the railroads included with these properties. To do so, it formed a subsidiary known as the Northern Coal and Iron Company, a conduit used for many years to oversee its rail operations. May I have the next slide, please? In May of 1867, the D&H received privileges from New York to begin rail construction in that state. This important mandate enabled the Delaware and Hudson to launch rail expansion northward. In the years after the Civil War, the Delaware and Hudson's rail service expanded rapidly. The company and the Erie Railway reached an agreement in 1868 to handle coal from the D&H at Carbondale via a branch of the Erie's main line at Lanesboro, Susquehanna, Pennsylvania. The product was then shipped west to Buffalo and the Great Lakes. The route was built under the name of the Jefferson Railroad. It was completed quickly, opening on October 28, 1870, with the Delaware and Hudson granted trackage rights to use the property. For the time being, D&H moved coal over the Erie Railroad from Lanesboro to Albany and Susquehanna Railroad at Binghamton. And just to show you here, this is the Erie Railroad here. And as you can see, it swings up this way to Rochester westward. To circumvent the roundabout nature of this route, D&H drew up plans to build a 27-mile shortcut from Lanesboro, Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania, to Nineveh, New York, where coal could move directly across both railroads and thus eliminate the Erie in the process. The new line was opened on June 17, 1872, providing the D&H a direct route from Wilkes-Barre to Albany via Binghamton. And on the map here, here's Lanesboro, and there's their direct route to Nineveh, New York. And I also want to point out why we have this map up. Here's Lake Champlain. So they ran on the western side of Lake Champlain. May I have the next slide, please? This map, a little clearer of the D&H Railway without all the other detail of the other map. Oh, thank you. In 1871, the D&H leased the Rensselaer and Saratoga Railroad north of the Albany area. And by 1875, it had completed a railroad along the west side of Lake Champlain. In the following years, a series of acquisitions pieced together a main line through northern New York State, western Vermont, and finally terminating in Montreal, Canada. The D&H Gravity Railroad operated until the Delaware and Hudson Canal was abandoned in 1898. The narrow gauge gravity railroad was replaced by a new standard gauge railroad. In my opinion, the glory years of the Delaware and Hudson Railroad were in the early 20th century, peaking in the late 1920s. May I have the next slide, please? The 1930s and World War II years saw a change in the way the D&H trains operated, from steam locomotives like this one, hauling heavy coal trains, to diesel locomotives hauling a variety of commodities and freight. May I have the next slide, please? In 1938, the D&H started to act as a bridge line, carrying large amounts of freight between other connecting railroad lines. May I have the next slide? In 1944, the Delaware and Hudson acquired its first diesel locomotive. After World War II, the Delaware and Hudson began to curtail passenger rail service as Americans turned to autos buses, trucks, and aircraft for their transportation needs. By July 1953, D&H diesel locomotives had relegated all steam locomotives to scrap. The last Delaware and Hudson locomotive ran on July 1, 1953. During the 1960s, the Delaware and Hudson Railroad experienced an atmosphere of declining business and rising costs. May I have the next slide? In 1973, the Delaware and Hudson celebrated its 150th anniversary as a company dating from the 1823 TA New York Canal charters. In 1976, the D&H expanded its reach during the reorganization of the Northeastern U.S. railroads. Congress formed the U.S. Railway Association, USRA, to form Conrail, and the D&H was expanded to help preserve rail transportation in the eastern United States. However, in 1988, D&H went into bankruptcy and was taken over by the Canadian Pacific Railway, or CP Rail. On January 1, 1991, CP was authorized to buy D&H for $25 million. And on December 1st, 2000, the Delaware and Hudson name was retired. Marianne, do I have enough time to talk about the Hudson Coal Company? Or should we? Okay. I would like to now speak about the Hudson Coal Company. May I have the next slide? Okay. On January 1, 1860, the D&H separated the coal and railroad departments. The Hudson Coal Company was incorporated in Pennsylvania in 1871 as a subsidiary of the Delaware and Hudson. In response to the Hepburn Act of June 29, 1906, prohibiting railroad corporations from transporting commodities such as coal that was owned by the railroad across state lines, the D&H formed a contract with the Hudson Coal Company. On June 1, 1909, the Hudson Coal Company purchased outright at the mine all coal produced from the mines remaining in the ownership of the Delaware and Hudson Company. And by later contract, the Hudson Coal Company undertook all mining operations. The decision also, for the first time, held that the Delaware and Hudson Company was, for the purposes of laws regulating interstate commerce, a railroad company. D&H anthracite was mined in the northern anthracite fields in Lackawanna and Wyoming valleys, with rail access to communities such as Clinton Township in Wayne County, Carbondale, Mayfield, German, Archbald, Oliphant, Dixon City, Scranton, Manuka, and Moosic in Lackawanna County, as well as Yatesville, Laughlin, Hanover Township, Hudson, Miners Mills, Parsons, Wilkes-Barre, Plymouth, Clarksville, and Kingston in Luzerne County. In 1917, the greatest year of anthracite production, the company's net tons production was 10,824,284 tons of anthracite, or about 11% of the total anthracite production that year. The company was the third largest producer of anthracite in northeastern Pennsylvania, employing 18,400 workers. In the anthracite region's 25 mining districts, the Delaware and Hudson Company was represented in 9. 95% of the market for D&H anthracite went to New England and mid-Atlantic states and Canada. The Hudson Coal Company declined in the 20th century, with America turning to oil, gas, and electricity for energy needs. In the early 1960s, it was acquired by the Glen Alden Corporation. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chester. As you can see, there's a lot to try to squeeze in when we start talking about all of these companies and all that they did. We get into the 90s and it gets fun. Our next speaker is a visitor from abroad, Luzerne County. He's made his way to Scranton, so we're grateful to Tony. Tony Brooks has been a leader in historic preservation and promotion of local history for the past 20 years. His architectural walking tours of Wilkes-Barre's River Street and Luzerne County Courthouse have been widely popular, and also Hollenbach Cemetery. In 2016, Tony hosted a public meeting to save the Iram Temple in downtown Wilkes-Barre, and from that meeting, the Iram Temple Restoration Project was formed, and a team assembled to restore, preserve, and interpret the history of a one-of-a-kind architectural gem that was built in 1907. In 2017, he led an effort to save the 1793 Zebulon Butler House, the oldest house in Wilkes-Barre, from demolition. And in 2020, he launched a YouTube channel on local history, Diamond City Trail of History. Currently, he's collaborating with the Times Leader Media Group and NEPA Camera Club to publish Great Historic Houses of Wilkes-Barre, a beautifully designed coffee table book featuring 100 historic houses, and also collaborating with the Osterhout Free Library to publish a children's book on Wilkes-Barre history. Brooks is the director and curator of the Wilkes-Barre Preservation Society, and his presentation today will offer a history of the Butler family and their role in anthracite history. Tony Brooks.
Thank you, Mary Ann. Always good when a Wilkes-Barre boy comes to Slocum Hollow. Ebenezer did a great job here, didn't he? He did a great job. So, all right. So my presentation is going to be genealogy, a little bit of architecture of the oldest house in Wilkes-Barre, and then the Butler family's role in anthracite coal. The first slide is from the American Building Survey, as you know, in good. Thank you. In the 1930s, there were the WPA projects that go around and document all the historic houses in America. And the slide shows the Zebulon Butler house. No problem, no problem. No. There we go. This is the Zebulon Butler house on South River Street. Next slide. Give you some context. If you know Wilkes-Barre well, this is the Zebulon Butler house. The Susquehanna River is right over here, and right over here is Wilkes University. Next slide is a picture of what the house looked like when we purchased it. The next slide is a picture of the house in 1910. The next slide is a picture of the house in 1934. Now, here's interesting. The next slide is the original house was 2 blocks in a different location. And the Butler family, well, 4 generations of the Butler family lived in this house. Then a young girl got married and her husband decided to move the house. The next slide shows the house, what it would have looked like. This is a 1934 photo, adding the one side. So what they did is they just took 2/3 of the house, put it on 3 logs, and rolled it down 2 blocks to South River Street. The next slide is the house that they built in its place. If you know everything about architecture, you know, we start out with log cabins, we have a wood frame house, go to brick, and you go to stone. So, and this is the Woodward house, and of course there's a Woodward Colliery that was in Larksville. So who are the Butlers? How did they get here, and what's their story? The next slide will show a picture of Mr. Butler, Zebulon Butler, who was born in 1731 and dies in 1795. And the next slide, the family comes from Ipswich, Massachusetts. And the next slide, you'll see that he was 4th generation from Massachusetts. Then he moves to Lyme, Connecticut, and then he comes to Wilkes-Barre. What things did he do right before coming to Wilkes-Barre? The next slide is the Battle of Quebec. Zebulon Butler served in the Pennsylvania and the Connecticut companies and served at the French and Indian War. And just a nice, interesting little factoid is this gentleman right here behind this is the death of General Wolfe or Montgomery, I can't remember. That's Isaac Berry, this guy right here. So that is the half of our namesake of Wilkes-Barre. This little side fact, John Wilkes and Isaac Berry never came to Wilkes-Barre. We don't even know if they knew it was named for them. The next slide, Zebulon Butler was a captain at the Battle of Havana and shipwrecked and on the shores of Cuba. He had a quite colorful life. But why did he come to Pennsylvania? Why did he come to, well, he didn't think he was coming to Pennsylvania. He was coming to Connecticut. In the next slide, you will see the Connecticut boundaries, the northern and southern parts of Connecticut, neatly go over the 1/3 of present-day Pennsylvania. But the Butlers and their cohorts with the Susquehanna Land Company of Connecticut thought they were coming to Connecticut. So that's the reason the Butlers come here, for more land. The next slide kind of gives you a context of what is going on at the time. You can see the Susquehanna Company is formed in 73. The Albany Congress is when the company buys, I put this in quote, buys the land from the Indians, from the Iroquois. French and Indian War comes into play and kind of stops any Western migration from Connecticut. But after the war, it picks up. And Zebulon Butler is appointed to lead the committee of settlers when they settle the very first 5 townships in 1769 that make up the present day Wyoming Valley from Wilkes-Barre to Pittston. And in 73, Mr. Butler builds a log cabin. Go to the next slide. You can see this is a representation of Fort Durkee, the first fort that was built in Wilkes-Barre. And you can see how what they did is they essentially build a bunch of little log cabins in a square to create their fort. Next slide. Mr. Butler goes on to become really the political and military leader of Wilkes-Barre. We can essentially call him the first family of Wilkes-Barre. He's elected as the town moderator, and then his family goes on to a lot of political power for several generations. But this is when he was justice of the peace. Probably the most famous thing, next slide, Mr. Butler did was lead the American forces at the Battle of Wyoming. Next slide. And then his house serves, the Butler House serves as the first courthouse for Luzerne County in 1787 until they built their own courthouse. They moved out of the Butler House. And the next slide is the first courthouse for Luzerne County. Now I'm going to go down through the generations that lived at the house and interlace the early history of coal. Next slide. Zebulon Butler's firstborn son and only son from his first wife was named Lord Butler. Very fancy, interesting name, right? You probably think he's a member of the British House of Lords. Well, his mother's last name was Lord, and so he becomes Lord Butler. And that name, Lord, is still used with Wilkes-Barre families today who descend from the Butlers from intermarriage. You can still find people using the name Lord as a middle name. Lord Butler went on to hold 14 different political offices. And my first example of nepotism in Luzerne County is when Zebulon Butler appoints his son, Lord Butler, the quartermaster of Fort Wilkes-Barre. And folks, it continues to this day, at least we think. One of the prominent things that Mr. Butler, Lord Butler did, next slide, is build the Easton Wilkes-Barre Turnpike, which is 115, which I know Beth Landmesser had to come down 115 to get here this evening. But here's what I found, and this is why I'm very thankful that you invited me to speak on the Butler Coal Company, because this is all new research, and I delved into different lectures that were given on anthracite industry, like we're doing today, previously. And turn to the next slide. I found that there was a lecture given, 2 coal lectures given in 1858, and this must be the earliest public lectures that were given to date. And the 2 lectures, one is on the geology of coal, and the other one is on industry, the early history of the industry there. And in the book, I find this quote. Now, we all heard of Jesse Fell's coal experiment, right? This is a big thing in Wilkes-Barre. At Jesse Fell's Tavern, he creates a grate and he burns anthracite without a draft, changing everything and how we heat our homes, right? From wood in our fireplaces to coal. Well, after Jesse Fell's experiment, printed in this book, first time I've ever seen this, was this quote: immediately following the new development of Fell's experiment, of its use as the coal for the supply of Wilkes-Barre came from Lord Butler's coal banks, now the Baltimore Company. So down in Wilkes-Barre, where the Home Depot is today, you will find a Baltimore mine tunnel explosion historical marker. That originally was an outcrop of coal that on the Butler farm. This is about, so the Butlers, if you picture downtown Wilkes-Barre today, that was just a little village. So this is about 1.5 miles, 2 miles east of Wilkes-Barre, where the Butlers had a farm, and he found coal, and he would bring it down to Wilkes-Barre. Lord Butler dies in 1824. His son in 1829 sells it to, next slide, to the Baltimore Coal Company. The Baltimore Coal Company was a series of investors, group of investors from Baltimore, Maryland, who came to Wilkes-Barre and bought coal lands from the Butlers to supply Baltimore with coal. So there's a brief, well, it's not, I couldn't say, it's not an incorporated coal company called the Butler Coal Company. It's just coal on the Butler farm that is supplying all the needs of consumer coal in the town of Wilkes-Barre up until his death in 1824. Now I'm going to go through a little bit about genealogy, and then I'll get to the real Butler Coal Company. Next slide. So the, this is where you can see on Public Square, Butler had a store right here. Here's an advertisement from 1817 where he would sell the coal and all other sorts of dry goods. He has a whole bunch of children, Lord Butler. He has 10 kids. And the next slide, one of his girls, Ruth Ann Butler, marries John Nesbitt Cunningham. Next slide. And then you have the Cunningham breaker that pops up on the Butler farm. I always had this joke about Mr. Cunningham. The smartest thing a guy can do when he moves to a new city, Cunningham moves to Wilkes-Barre in 1820, is you find the richest girl in town and you marry her. That's what he did. So, and then we have the Cunningham breaker. That is, if you can picture Lion Brewery on Cunningham Avenue in Wilkes-Barre off the boulevard, that's where the breaker was. Now I'm going to quick go down who lived in the house and then jump over to the Butler Coal Company and actually how the Butlers come actually into my life today. Next slide. So Lord Butler has a son named Pierce Butler and another son named Chester Butler. If you know Kingston well, I'm starting to name all the streets in Kingston because there was a huge Butler farm in Kingston. Chester Butler actually serves in the United States Congress. He's a Whig member. He sits next to Abraham Lincoln in that one term that Lincoln sat in the House of Representatives. Next slide. Then Chester Butler has a son, Pierce Butler has a son named James Montgomery Butler. If you think of Kingston again, there's James Street, right? And Butler Street. That was the whole farm. And then his son, George Hollenbeck Butler, he's the gentleman who develops all the big mansions in Kingston. And his mansion still exists today next to Grace Episcopal Church. And he really goes into the real estate business. Never coal. Montgomery Butler, not coal either, just farmers and a real estate developer. Next slide is the generation comes down again. John Lord Butler is the son of George Hollenbeck Butler. And then the next generation, this guy was my friend who died in 2010. He's the last living Butler in the Wilkes-Barre area. All the Butlers now, his kids live all around the country. So there's no more Butlers with the name. Okay, go back to the next slide. We'll go back to the coal company. So the Butler Coal Company of Pittston is founded in 1835 by John Butler, his brother Lord Butler, and their brother-in-law, Garrick Mallory. Garrick Mallory marries the sisters of the Butlers there. And they form the Butler Coal Company. Next slide, please. John Lord Butler creates one of the very earliest maps we have of the Wyoming and Lackawanna Valley of the coal. And you know we're all one valley. We got two names, but we're one valley, right? Where's passport control? Got right here. And next slide, up at a close-up, you'll see here's the downtown village of Wilkes-Barre, and you'll see Butler. This is where then the Butler coal mine, so the Butlers owned all here, and then then in Pittston, the Butlers had a coal mine as well. Turn to the next slide. Here is in 1877 where the breaker is, and the Butler Railroad comes down, and then here's the Susquehanna River. If you turn to the next slide, you'll see it even more so. So there's the breakers, then here's the Butler Coal Company coming down into the canals. What I find very interesting is their partner / brother-in-law, Garrick Mallory, here comes Luzerne County politics again. He gets elected to the state house in 1824 for the sole purposes of making sure the canal comes all the way up to Pittston. And what do you know? The canal finally comes to Pittston at the same time that they start a coal company. How brilliant is that? They stay in business until they die. In 1863, the Butler Coal Company goes up for a sheriff's sale. All the land goes up onto the market. And what I found from my research is I asked myself, why didn't this company stay in the family and keep on going? Everyone died all at the same time. It's kind of remarkable. So Lord Butler dies in 1858, and John, his brother, in 1861. Nobody take over. I researched all of their children and their other brothers' children. Pierce Butler, another Pierce Butler, became the chief mechanic of the D&H Gravity Railroad. He lived in Carbondale for a very long time. But none of the other Butlers had kids that were interested in the industry. They all went off to college and never came home. Most of them went into the legal world or different businesses. So it escaped out of their hands, but the name kept on going because the Butler Coal Company stays in business until 1966. So from 1835 to 1966. And you most likely have heard of the infamous Butler mine tunnel, right? That is the Butler Coal Company that started, and that there was also a big explosion. 1938, there was a gas explosion at the Butler Colliery when it was owned by Santo Volpe at the time. And there's a lot of, if you go back and read the newspaper articles in 1938 about the explosion at the Butler Colliery, you read all the names and like they all pop up again when we have what happens at the Knox mine disaster. You see all the same names, but this is in the 30s. So the company keeps going on, and finally it goes out in 66. And then there's a gas station, right, that poured oil and substances down into the tunnel that went out to the mine, and then it became a Superfund site. And now it's not on that list anymore. But I find it really, really fascinating. I hope you enjoyed my talk.
Thanks, Tony. Okay, we have a final speaker zooming in from Wisconsin. Our dear friend Bob Wolensky had a flu for the last couple of weeks. He's recovered, but not up for traveling. So he asked if he could zoom in. And so Bob should be coming up on the screen behind me shortly. Bob, in case you don't know, is a native of the area. He serves as Professor Emeritus of Sociology at the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, and an adjunct professor of history at King's College in Wilkes-Barre. He has been studying the Anthracite region history for many years and authored or co-authored several articles and books, including the Knox mine disaster, 1999 and 2005, Tragedy at Avondale, 2008, Anthracite labor wars, 2013, revised in 2020, and Sown in Coal Country, 2020. Today, as I said, he's zooming in from Wisconsin to talk about the Pennsylvania Coal Company. And I know that Tony just mentioned one of his favorite people. So I think that's a great way to lead in to Bob Wolensky, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much. I'm so happy to be here, Marianne, and to say hello to my colleagues, Tony and Chester and Charlie. Thanks for participating in this session. I'm here to talk about what I will call the PACC, the Pennsylvania Coal Company, because it's one of the bigger ones. It's one of the more controversial ones. And its history, I think, is really important for both the Luzerne County and Lackawanna County areas. You know where we're talking about. And we're talking about the Northern Coal Field, and Pennsylvania Coal Company is sort of in the middle of it here. The Old Forge, Dunmore, Pittston, Port Griffith, Port Blanchard area. That's where most of its facilities are. Established in 1838 by the State General Assembly. And they had to pass laws to create these companies. The shareholders came mainly from New York City, northeastern PA. Chester talked about this with the D&H. New York City had the capital, had the money. And we see people coming up from Baltimore and, of course, Philadelphia. That's where the money was. The state, through its charter laws, permits capitalization of $200,000 for the company. And it allowed them to buy 100 acres in Pittston Township. State controlled all this through its charter laws. In 1849, it merged with the Wyoming Coal Association. and reestablished the Pennsylvania Coal Company. Some local investors come in, and the state again passes a law to give it permission to buy 12,000 acres in Dunmore and Pittston. And of course, those acres are underlain with anthracite. In 1850, it builds the gravity railroad to take coal from Pittston and Dunmore and to the D&H Canal at Hawley and then on to New York City. In 1850, it's the second largest producer after the D&H. And in 1853, the Pennsylvania establishes the city of Pittston, which was, quote, both a coal town and a company town from its founding, says Mr. Folsom. Here we go. This has a tendency to jump. Here's some gravity photos. This is from Sal Mecca. This is the gravity was the best way to do this, as we know. It was a very advanced technology for its time. Production goes up, as you can see.
Bob,
Yes.
I don't think you're sharing your screen.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
We've been enjoying your face, though.
Oh, I am so sorry.
That's all right.
Let me see. I hit screen share, but it didn't take.
Okay. You have to start sharing once you hit it.
Yes, I guess that was it. Let me start again.
Okay.
Here we go.
There you go.
There's where I am.
Okay.
Sorry about that, folks. I won't backtrack given the time, but I will backtrack to Sal Mecca's photo. Thanks for pointing that out, Marion. And let me go to there we go. So there's the production. Up, 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 up. Labor force in Dunmore in 1865 and in Pittston had about 2,500 people in two locations, two centers. Scots made up the majority of the early workers. These guys settled in Carbondale between 1830 and 1850, and many moved to Hawley to work on the canal, and many more moved to Pittston to work in those mines. And the Scottish presence was at Pennsylvania into the 1960s. The superintendent of the Knox Coal Company, which had leased from the Pennsylvania Coal Company, coming up on that, was a Scotsman. John B. Smith was one of the early executives. This photograph is from the Lackawanna Historical Society. Thank you. Headquarters of the company in Dunmore, a very impressive building built at the turn of the century. Some of its facilities, the Central Colliery, wooden. The number 6. This is now getting into metal, steel. The Erie Railroad comes into the picture because the company signs agreements with the Erie to transport its coal. In 1901, Morgan, the famous J.P. Morgan, buys the company for about $950 million in contemporary terms. It was the last big company to fall to Morganization. Morgan was buying them all up, you know. All major anthracite railroads, who in turn owned all the major companies, Lehigh Valley, you know, the DL&W and so forth. The Reading, all owned by Morgan by 1901. Morgan, great monopolist. Was specific with regard to the Erie coal companies, as they now called them, owned by the Erie Railroad, which Morgan bought. The Pennsylvania, the Hillside Coal and Iron, and Tony, the Hillside Coal and Iron actually bought the Butler Coal Company around the turn of the century, and then later on sold it to Santa Volpe. The Susquehanna and Western Railroad and Coal Company was also a very small subsidiary, but the big one was the Pennsylvania Coal Company. This is the number 9 in Ustown. This is the old forge. $1 million breakers, had the capitalization. And there's one of its Lokis, two of its Lokis. Well, the organization changes after Morgan gets hold of it. And it's a money machine. It's really, I mean, it's always a money machine, but now it's really a money machine. And so he begins, the management begins leasing and subcontracting in 1913 to Santo Volpe and Charles Consegra, two of the local mob leaders. And they get a series of lease and subcontracting agreements with Volpe, who goes on, as I mentioned, buys the Butler in the 1930s. He buys 2 or 3 companies to become one of the largest so-called independent, that means not owned by a railroad, producer. Several mobsters participate in this, including the owners of the Knox Coal Company, who leased from Pennsylvania, as I mentioned. Here's the Ewan. The Knox mine was on the coal property formerly operated by the Ewan in Jacobs Township. In 1905, the UMWA, the United Mine Workers Union, called the PACC and Cox as among the chief corporate troublemakers in anthracite. According to the journal, the Erie, and that's the Erie Coal Companies, had pursued, pursued a course totally unworthy of a great corporation and seemed destitute of faith, which holds mankind together. So a real condemnation, union busting, coal scavenging, whatever it takes. We don't care who we lease to. You don't find other companies leasing to the mob, but you do the Erie Coal Companies, especially the Pennsylvania and the Hillside Coal and Iron Company. Again, Hillside is the one who sells out the Butler to Santo Volpe. The charge came when the union was seeking to hold on to the Erie employees who were wavering by 1905 in their commitment. They were all there in 1902 for the big strike, but then the Erie men began to waver because they didn't think that the UMWA was doing enough to protect them from one of the most predacious companies. So they were drifting away. In 1911, PACC owned 10 collieries. 6 in 1930 were working, and 4 were idle because of the economic downturn. You may have heard of the ones in Lackawanna County, the Old Fords, number 5, number 1, Gypsy Grove. Luzerne County, the number 14, the Ewan, the number 6, the number 9, and the Barnum. And the Central was in both counties. It overlapped the counties. It was known, again, as a very labor destructive company. It was what I call the Wild East at Pennsylvania Coal Company between the 10s and the 30s. In Pittston, Old Forge, Dunmore, etc. Strike after strike, murders, beatings, really very, very violent. Among the most militant were Rinaldo Capellini, who you may have heard of. Alec Campbell and Peter Riley were assassinated by the mob at the behest of Santo Volpe because they were hindering his leasing operations. William Brennan, who becomes president of the District 1 local, they were all Pennsylvania Coal Company employees, and so was Monsignor Curran, the famous J. Curran, whose evening we celebrated Thursday night, his lecture at King's College. But so did August Lippy, the notorious August Lippy, the last president of the District 1, who was in cahoots with the mob, a part owner of the Knox Coal Company, August J. Lippy. You can't be a union president and a coal company president at the same time. Of course, he was at the QT. He was on the sly at Knox. And James Musto, Raphael's father, he was blackballed by the company because he was a union activist. Later on becomes a state senator. But subcontracting and leasing were the source of a lot of the conflict. 12,000 workers in 1920. The Van Swearingans buy it out. in 1924, these railroad barons, they buy it from the Morgan interests. They establish Allegheny. It becomes very complicated. Sounds like what Charlie was talking about, a lot of buying and selling. The company survives the Van Swearingens. The series of owners survives them, but barely survives the Knox mine disaster. I say it leases out to them illegal mining under the Susquehanna River at Port Griffith. The chairman, the president of the Knox Coal Company was the top boss after Santa Volpe in the Pittston area. So it was a mob coal company. There's an infamous picture by the Lucasic Studios of dumping in coal cars to block the Knox. But this company keeps on surviving. It was a wholly owned subsidiary of the bankrupt Erie-Lackawanna Railway in 1978, according to the Times Leader Evening News. It's selling land, as was Penn Anthracite, but it was sold out to Conrail in 1976. In 64, it was still issuing leases. This firm has 9 lives, but as we say, it was owned by the Erie-Lackawanna, and then it went on to Conrail. The last officer was Stuart Milner, who I've interviewed. He was in Scranton. He was the vice president. He said, I held this position of VP till the time that the company sold all the remaining lands, which was in December of 78. Since then, I've been semi-retired. But at present time, I have custody of all the maps, all the sales records, all the deed books, and other documents of the Pennsylvania Coal Company. And the company, it's out of business just about. But he let me loose in his office, which was in the Dunmore building of the PACC before it was, I'm sorry to say, so sorry to say, knocked down, 6, 7, 8 years ago. It's just a great tragedy. That would have been a wonderful building for local history. But it's gone, like so many things are gone, including the Huber. But I got a lot of information out of there. I saved a lot of stuff out of there. It's up at the Anthracite Museum. So thanks very much. I'm a little bit rushing, but I see the time is getting short. We have exactly 3 minutes for questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we have exactly 3 minutes for questions. So does anyone have any questions? As I said, if you have a question that's going to be lengthy or detailed and you want to come up so that the live stream microphone gets you, please do that. But if you think you just have a simple raise your hand question, I'm happy to repeat it. And then gentlemen, you can answer right from the table because the mics are on the table as well. So does anyone have any questions? Yes, sir.
I'm interested in the many districts had all different branding of the benefits of their anthracite coal. As you went west, like into the Bernice Field or say Dauphin County, when did you get to the point where it was a sub-anthracite or something which was not up to the standards of this valley or the southern fields of anthracite?
Well, I think in Sullivan County, there was a semi-anthracite field that I'm aware of that's on the maps at the Anthracite Heritage Museum. And then in Western Pennsylvania, of course, you had various types of bituminous coal, both the low and high volatile. The Pittsburgh seams for bituminous, they were excellent for coking.
I realize that. Where is technically the line drawn that this is anthracite and that isn't?
Well, I would say northeastern Pennsylvania, there's about 11 counties that are anthracite, ranging from a little bit in Susquehanna and Wayne, all the way down to Culver City and Dauphin County and Harrisburg. And then you go east to like the Mauch-Chunk area, and then you can go west over to Trevorton and Shamokin. That would be the western middle field. But it's that area of Sullivan County that I think you're sort of transitioning from that semi-anthracite and then going west to the bituminous.
They were called the Bernice fields.
Yes, yes.
In Sullivan County.
Yeah.
As I understand it, that's a semi-anthracite, and even Wyoming County had some semi-anthracite deposits. It's not as hard as the real anthracite.
They have to market that separately.
They did sell it separately. It was even their own coal company out that way.
Yeah, and Hudson did a lot of testing of its coal. There's photographs at the Anthracite Heritage Museum where they have laboratories where they're burning to see what content would be ash and what would be the impurities and what would be the volatility of it. So I know even with the Wirtz brothers, they had trouble in part of their early history with people complaining about the quality of certain types of coal. So yeah, you get a lot of variety in throughout the region. And I think that's why the companies tested their product. And the way they would do the test is when there was a gondola ready to leave the yard, they would send somebody out and take shovel tests right out of the cart, out of the railroad cart. And then they'd label those and take them back to the lab and then burn and test those in case on the other end, if the customers had any complaints.
Bob, do you want to add anything?
No, I think Chester's right. I think it's 10 counties. It may drift over into an 11th, but those 10 counties, the 95% of the anthracite in this hemisphere is there. And there are several grades. I mean, lignite is on the bottom. I mean, there's lignite mines, Ireland, for example, but that's the worst kind of coal. And then all the way up on the top to anthracite, semi-bituminous. There's bituminous, central Pennsylvania, Clearfield. That's a very good grade of bituminous. I think that there's some semi-anthracite near there, but the hard coal stuff is in these 10 counties.
Anybody else want to chime in, Tony?
That's the famous 484 square miles.
Yeah, yeah.
There you go.
And an area the size of Manhattan is underlain with the coal measures. So it's, quite a small area, really. Manhattan Island.
Any other questions? Comments? All right.
One comment.
One comment.
The bridge was mentioned as having steel wires, iron wire.
Wow, wrought iron.
Wrought iron wire on the Lackawanna Bridge. One correction. That's not too bad. I want to thank everyone for coming. I do want to do one last commercial before we leave. The final program for Anthracite Mining Heritage Month is happening tomorrow at 2 p.m. at Luzerne County in the Historical Society, 69 South Franklin Street. Author Jane M. Booth is going to be there talking about her book series, Rocked in the Cradle of Coal, focusing on Pennsylvania children of coal mines. She's completed #1 book, which is called Peeling Potatoes, Katie's Story, and she's going to give a little sneak peek at the second book in the series. So perhaps you want to visit Luzerne County tomorrow and learn a little bit about children in Pennsylvania coal mines, or tell some of your friends that might have some younger folks that could get interested in our coal mining heritage now for the future. So thanks to all of our presenters, Tony Brooks, Chester Kulesa, Charlie Kumpas, and Bob Wolensky. And thanks to all of you for participating. Maybe I will see you at happy hour. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.